What is happening? Oh. Okay.
Love it.
No.
Are we not having a quiz?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. Fuck no. Just no. Were y'all expecting a quiz?
Well, yeah.
I don't know what day it is. I don't know what time it is. If you all appreciate it, like I'm sleeping on the floor on a bunch of couch cushions and we put a thin sheet around.
It's what happens when you're 19 months in.
Pardon? Doesn't stay like savings time and just the whole everything's real messed up right now. So there's not going to be a quiz. I'll just give you guys. We're going to have it as a group. I'll just give you guys credit for the quiz. We're just going to move forward, and I will not penalize you guys for being back. Okay? All right. We need to start talking about the cardiovascular responses to exercise. There it is. Lecture over. Okay? I'll be short. I'll be brief. There you go. You start exercising, cardiac output goes up. Okay? You're going to get an increase in skin blood flow, decrease in blood flow to the kidneys and the spleen, maintenance or a small increase in blood flow to the brain, increased flow in the coronary arteries. I have no idea why I have increased in blood flow twice. It's important, but it's not like doubly important of everything else. So what we're attempting to do by changing blood pressures and cardiac output and things is we're trying to maintain, or we're trying to balance, okay, shifting flow to muscles, okay, shifting cardiac output to muscles, while maintaining blood pressure and therefore perfusion to the heart and the brain, okay, so that we can stay alive by having blood flow to the brain. We're going to need more to go to the heart because it's going to be asked to work much, much harder during exercise because the muscles need so much more so they can send oxygen and nutrients and things to the muscles and remove CO2. Okay? So my guess is that probably all of you outside of Pearson have seen this. It's a pretty standard undergraduate concept. And so here is cardiac output. We're graphing Q here. You've got treadmill speed on the x-axis, okay? So we're running faster and faster and faster. We have actual measured cardiac output here on the y-axis. And what you will note is that as we run faster, so as exercise intensity increases, we get this relatively linear increase in cardiac output, okay? I'm sure you guys have all seen this already. This probably makes a lot of sense. I need more nutrients, I need more oxygen, so I need to increase cardiac output. I got to circulate the blood that I have more. Okay? We've talked a lot about what are the things that control heart rate, things that control stroke volume change that we're going to see that are going to lead to this increase in cardiac output. Okay? So, for the most part, all right, the increases are going to be kind of very much one-to-one with the increase in exercise intensity. I think we're going to talk about the Fick equation here in a couple of slides. And the Fick equation is a way for us to try to calculate oxygen consumption if we know cardiac output and we know O2 extraction at the mitochondria through something called the arterial venous oxygen difference. Okay? So cardiac output goes up, but the real question is, well, why the hell is it going up? What's happening? Okay? Well, heart rate, we can argue is the most important because heart rate is going to increase. We're going to remove some of our vagal tone. We're going to increase our sympathetic nervous system output as we go through all of this, right? And so that's going to drive heart rate up. The change in heart rate in response to exercise is also linear. It's going to end up looking very, very much like the increase in the change in cardiac output. Stroke volume is also going to increase. That is due to an increase in preload because of an increase in venous return. It's going to be due to an increase in contractility because of an increase in the force of contraction of the left ventricle due to sympathetic nervous system interactions. And we're going to get vasodilation out at skeletal muscle, which is going to lower total peripheral resistance. So the combination of all of these things is going to lead to an increase in stroke volume up to a point, okay? Up to a point. At a certain point, we can no longer increase stroke volume. So the heart rate change looks like this, relatively linear as it goes up here from left to right, okay? You will note that as we get way out here, you can, in some instances, especially if you get really highly trained people, you can see a plateau in heart rate at the top that looks like a plateau in oxygen consumption. But it's going to only come in certain kinds of exercise protocols. You probably need a person that's really, really, really highly trained to get your best chance to be able to see it. Because untrained people, by the time they get here, they're so miserable they're going to stop. Okay. Conversely, if you look at the, you guys ever like cough or sneeze with your mask on, like think you're going to die? Like what's going to happen? It's going to like get stuck or something. Okay, good. Well, that's just not me. So treadmill speed, heart rate goes up. Here we have stroke volume going up. But at a certain point, it's going to begin to level off. And then as you get on out past maybe 60% of max heart rate or 60% of VO2 max, most of the time stroke volume is going to plateau and level off. Okay, so you get this nice linear increase early, and then it levels off. So after this point out here, heart rate's the only thing that you have left to be able to increase or change in order to make cardiac output go up. My apologies, I'm turning this off. My father is texting me. Usually it's my mom that texts me with like 8 questions. I'm like, Mom, breathe like one at a time, like one time. And there's like a list of questions. What about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? How's Ellis? It always. I'm like, I know that that's really what you want to know. You just want a picture of Ellis, which is fine. That's all fine and dandy. So that's going to plateau. So we're going to talk about kind of why that plateaus and why, weirdly enough, because stroke volume plateaus and because of the things that are going to control heart rate, why stroke volume is actually the more important of the two for determining what your maximum cardiac output is going to be, and therefore determining what your maximal oxygen consumption is. Okay? So we've talked about that we're going to get an increase in preload and an increase in contractility and a decrease in total peripheral resistance, all of which, as these things are going to begin to happen, are going to lead to this increase. But at some point, even though we may be able to get a little bit of a further drop in peripheral resistance, at some point preload and contractility are going to be maxed out. You cannot make them go up anymore no matter what you do. Your left ventricle is only so big. It can only contract so forcefully, regardless of how much we're trying to apply Frank Starling and epinephrine and norepinephrine to it. It can only stretch so much, right? You're doing a squat, you can only go down until your butt's on the ground. And even at that point, that's probably deleterious to your vertebrae. There's only so much that we can do. There are physical and mechanical limitations to these two things, okay? And so once we have maxed these two things out, then stroke volume is going to plateau, okay? That's kind of what we're working with. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. All right. We're going to come back to cardiac output in a second, but we're going to shift now to another cardiovascular variable that I think is pretty cool. Other people think that it's very confusing, but we'll do our best to try to work our way through this. And it's something called arterial venous oxygen difference, okay? AVO2 diff, or AVO2 difference, all right? So what it is, it's a way for us to quantify the amount of oxygen that is extracted or taken out of the blood by a particular tissue as it is circulating around, okay? So we calculate it as the difference between the amount of oxygen that we measure in arterial blood on one side of the tissue and venous blood on the other side of that tissue. Does that make sense? So now to do this, we could run a double catheter. We could run an arterial catheter and a venous catheter into my femoral artery and my femoral vein. And we could directly try to measure oxygen on the blood in the femoral artery. I could do some knee extension exercise, or I could ride a bike, or whatever else that you guys want me to do. And then we could measure how much oxygen is in the venous blood that's working its way back up to the heart. And the assumption behind all of this is that if there's a change, if there's a difference between those two things, that difference reflects oxygen that has been taken out of the blood by some tissue that is downstream of where we have run or where we've measured in the artery. Does that make sense? So doing it in the brachial artery and the brachial vein is fine, but we can get kind of a big picture look at things. Or we could measure in the aorta and the superior vena cava, and that would give us an estimate of whole body AVO2 difference. But it doesn't tell us a whole lot about, okay, well, we know that my leg is using it somewhere, but it doesn't tell us a lot about, is my quad getting it? Is my calf getting it, right? Is my TA getting it? You have to be a little more precise if you want to do those things, okay? So at rest, the AVO2 difference tends to be about 6 milliliters of oxygen. Not that that number means anything to you guys, okay? During exercise, we're going to extract about 3-fold more oxygen from the blood. So AVO2 difference is going to go up substantially, right? And a lot of this is simply driven by that one cardiac output is going up. So there's physically more oxygen in it moving past the tissue in a given period of time, which I know has always been a tough thing for me to wrap my head around, right? There's not more oxygen in the blood, but more blood is going by, right? So if there's a small number of cars going by and you got to get across the road, your chances of getting hit, maybe not that great. There's a bunch of cars going across the road and you got to go, your chances of getting hit, right, are much, much higher. So the more blood that goes by, the greater the chance there is that we can extract something, okay? The other piece of that, though, is that the diffusion gradients are going to change very, very much so during exercise, okay? O2 in the muscle, because mitochondria are using it, that O2 gradient is going to fall. So it's going to be a bigger difference between the amount of oxygen in the capillary side bound to hemoglobin and what's in the muscle. So it's going to work to pull more and more out. But the end of all of this is that AVO2 difference is going to go up about 3-fold. Okay? So remember, cardiac output can go up, right? Maybe 4 or 5-fold. AVO2 difference is going up 3-fold or thereabouts. And if we wanted to, we can put all of this together and we can calculate about what your maximal amount of O2 extraction is going to be. And that's going to give us a pretty good estimate of what your VO2 is. Okay? So I like this graph. This graph visually makes sense to me because it shows in some ways what's happening. Okay? Here we have what they're calling our arterial capacity. This is, in theory, if you could 100% saturate hemoglobin in your arterial blood. Okay? Most of us cannot 100% saturate. It doesn't matter, right? We are way, way, way oversaturated. Okay? For those of you that had is here, which is really just Ryan, Kelvin, and Callie, I think Dr. Mike loves the hemoglobin dissociation curve about as much as he loves Dr. Deb and their dogs. I am less enamored of the hemoglobin dissociation curve. We're going to show it. We're going to talk about the Bohr effect very briefly, but Dr. Mike really, really loves the hemoglobin dissociation curve. So it's fine. I would much rather we talk about muscles. So the blue here is arterial content. You will notice pretty much the same. Always try to remember, if we're at sea level or not too high, and you have good, normal pulmonary function, your hemoglobin are going to be somewhere between 96 and 99% saturated all the time, okay? You've really got to go to altitude before this is going to begin to fall, okay? You've really got to have some impairments in pulmonary physiology before you have, at sea level, you're going to see a fall in arterial content, okay? Now, this seems to be potentially, I would be interested to talk to some docs again, but a fall in this while you have COVID may be maybe one of the precipitating things that says you're about to have to go into the ICU. maybe not to get put on a ventilator. This is the thing that may be one of the kind of hallmark things of I've got it and I feel shitty, but I'm doing okay, right? It's kind of like maybe I have mild asthma or something. I'm having a little bit of difficulty, but I'm not really, really in distress. But then as arterial content can take a big dip, right? It may get down into the low 90s, which is not that terrible. If it gets into the 80s, then we probably need to go see somebody and check all of that out. To that end, early in the process, my wife made us buy, we have a little finger O2 sat here that we just put on. We'll put it on Ella. She likes to play with it now. We're teaching her physiology. You know, she's not even 2. And I'm like, that's right, cardiologist, let's go. So, Daddy wants to retire early, and you can take care of yourself. Anyway, here's venous O2 content. Here's arterial content. So as exercise intensity goes up, so oxygen uptake or energy expenditure is increasing. Note that arterial content doesn't change, but venous content is going to fall. Now you can imagine that this is being measured in the aorta and in the superior vena cava, right? So we're running 2 central lines, if you will, in that way. But I like the graph because you can see that this is what's falling, and that makes that difference bigger, okay? We okay with this? Keldon, you okay with this? Yes? Okay, did you power clean today?
No, I just got done biking. I know.
I'm biking. Okay, that's good. I'd like to exercise. Anybody want to like give me time? Anybody want to do my ACSM presentation tomorrow at lunchtime for me so I can go exercise? No? Okay. Here's the blood pressure response. Diastolic pressure should stay relatively similar. You shouldn't have a change in diastolic pressure. Diastolic pressure changes, we got big problems, right? Call the ambulance. If it goes up, that's not good. If it goes down, that's also not good. We need diastolic pressure to be very, very constant. If it falls, you're about to pass out. If it goes up, you may be about to have a stroke or a heart attack or something, so not great. Systolic pressure, on the other hand, not so bad. Systolic pressure is going to go up or going to tend to go up during exercise. Okay. So as the heart contracts more and more forcefully, then systolic pressure rises. You have a rise in systolic pressure. We have a drop in total peripheral resistance. So here's pressure, let's just say inside the left ventricle, and then we're going to drop the pressure in the aorta. We're going to drop the pressure downstream somewhere, and we're going to expand the pressure gradient for driving blood flow. Okay, so that's a good thing. It's going to be a good thing. It's going to improve our driving pressure. So the red and the green are going to represent the arms and the legs. Weirdly enough, Keldon, did you do arm cycling or leg cycling?
Both.
Both? Seriously? Okay.
Yeah.
So arm cycling, because it's a smaller muscle mass that is engaged, you're going to get a less of a drop in peripheral resistance. And so you're going to see a slightly higher diastolic pressure and a slightly higher systolic pressure response. Okay. Sorry. Very, very famous data I'm about to show you guys here. Okay. So these are the relationship between cardiac output and VO2 max. When these things were discovered, this was really, really groundbreaking types of things. I do appreciate that to you guys. These are data from Per Olof Ostrand. I don't have my umlauts on here like I need them, but they're from the mid-60s. And what you can see basically is here's oxygen uptake on the x-axis, here's cardiac output on the y-axis. And you will note basically that they are mapping either in submaximal or maximal work, right? The closed in squares are all going to be VO2 max values, but you'll note this nice, like, kind of relatively linear relationship between cardiac output and oxygen uptake at any time. Okay. Here's some data from Lauren Rowell, also a really, really freaking big deal, but it's showing cardiac output and the change in cardiac output as VO2 goes up. And what I think is really, really interesting, and we'll show this in some other data as well, especially if you look at VO2 data. So you guys notice that we have a sedentary person and we have an athlete. And what you can see is that the athlete has a larger cardiac output, and therefore they have a larger VO2 max. But the change in the slopes of these lines are basically the same. Okay? So a sedentary person or an untrained person is going to look like, and they're going to have similar O2 demand and similar kinetic changes and things as an athlete, right up until the point they can't go anymore, and the athlete can just keep trucking along. Okay? So hemodynamically, we're all going to function relatively similar. It's just that the athletes can go farther. It's all the slope of all of this is pretty much the same. Now, if we were to have some sort of cardiovascular impairment or pathology, some sort of pulmonary pathology, then we can maybe shift the slope of those. Okay? This is heart rate versus VO2. Again, these are data from Rowell. Here's our athletes. And what I want you to notice is the slopes are pretty much the same, but that at the same oxygen consumption value, we have a higher heart rate in our sedentary people. Okay? So it takes more heart rate. So in theory, it's probably taking more of a larger percentage of their cardiac output to get themselves to that VO2. And so then it goes up, and our athletes are going to be there. Okay? Here's stroke volume. Now, stroke volume, we've got upright exercise. They did a standing thing. They did the supine. They sat down and then they stood back up. Here, don't worry about that. But what I want to show you guys is that sedentary athletes. Okay, remember, sedentary athletes have a larger maximum cardiac output and a larger maximum VO2. Look at this. Slope of change in stroke volume about the same, but my athletes have a much larger stroke volume to begin with than my sedentary individuals. Heart rate, we're all getting up, if they're about the same age, we're all getting up to very close to the same max heart rate, but by having a bigger stroke volume, that enables me to have a larger maximum cardiac output. And therefore, I can deliver more oxygen. Right? Alex, is that convective or diffusive? It's okay. I'm pretty sure it's convective, but that's okay. In the midst of all of this. So what we've got, I just don't want you guys, let's see if you like get PTSD from all of that or something, like how to do this. But the things work about the same. Athletes just have bigger stroke volume. Why? They have a bigger heart. Okay? They literally have a bigger heart. The left ventricle is bigger, so you can put more blood in it. Okay, so there's a very famous equation. Probably not as famous as like Poiseuille's equation or something, just for exercise physiologists or physiologists in general. The Fick equation represents the relationship between O2 consumption at any point, okay, from rest to maximal exercise, to AVO2 difference and cardiac output. And it tells us that O2 consumption can be calculated, right, as long as we know cardiac output and we know what AVO2 difference is. So if we know how much blood you're circulating, and we know how much oxygen you're taking out of that blood that is circulating, then we can make the assumption that the muscles are using whatever they're taking out. That will be your O2 consumption at that particular point. So VO2 is equal to heart rate multiplied by stroke volume multiplied by AVO2 difference. So if we want to look at maximal VO2, VO2 max is equal to maxed out cardiac output and maxed out AVO2 difference. So it's maxed out heart rate, maxed out stroke volume, maxed out AVO2 difference. So you got to think about what determines the max for each of these. What determines max heart rate? Age, good. What determines max stroke volume? What determines preload and contractility, Jacob? You're right.
Well, part of us to say something like activity, because if you increase that, you're having increased.
You're right, but also
Heart size.
And its ability to respond to sympathetic activity. Okay? So age, which is the change with age, is related to response to sympathetic activity. Size and response to sympathetic activity. What determines max for AVO2 difference? Anybody want to wager a guess?
Mitochondrial density.
Yes. Is it on like the next slide?
No, I didn't use my brain.
Use your brain. Yay! Yeah, so mitochondrial density plays a role in that, capillary density plays a role in that. We have to be able to set up gradients to be able to actually move VO2. So one of the ways. We need a big sink to pull it into using the mitochondria, and we need lots of little capillaries to run it, pipes to run it down. Okay? So my athletes, if they're the same age, basically have the same max heart rate, but my athletes have a larger stroke volume, and they very often have a much larger AVO2, maximal AVO2 difference because they have more mitochondria. Okay, there we go. We got those two things. Direct Fick. So direct Fick is going to talk about how are we going to measure AVO2 difference and cardiac output. So the easiest thing that we can do is we just got to run a catheter, okay? Sucks. We can do something called CO2 rebreathing into a Douglas bag. Jacob, do they have a K-State? Do they have an old-timey oxygen analyzer and the old school Douglas bags to breathe into? They're from the 1950s. Any of those laying around? We don't have any here. But
I'm sure they do up in pool and bushes stuff, but I don't think we use them or anything.
So when I was a grad student in our department chair's lab, they had a O2 analyzer that was on a cart that ran. It was about 2 feet wide and about 4 feet long, and it was about 8 feet tall. And it was stacked up on this thing, and it was probably from the 1940s or the 50s or something. And they had what was called a Douglas bag. It was just a giant balloon, and you would put the thing on, and you would breathe, and then you would breathe back in the air that you had exhaled. So you were breathing in increasingly large quantities of CO2 and increasingly small quantities of oxygen, and you could do the Douglas bag for certain amounts of time and then take it and go sample air from the Douglas bag and try to calculate AVO2 difference. And if I know AVO2 difference and I know heart rate, I can estimate stroke volume. Okay? And then if I can estimate stroke volume and I have heart rate, then I can calculate cardiac output. So it's a way to get at doing some of these kinds of things. We don't do it that much anymore. We hook you up to the Interpolation, and it just tells us an estimate, whatever that's going to be. Okay? So people call that the Fick Principle, that you're going to take a sample of mixed venous blood and a sample of arterial blood, and you're going to look at the differences. Be there. There's CO2 rebreathing. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. Okay. Here at the end, right? This is almost all that we have. So let's talk very quickly about something called oxygen carrying capacity. Okay. This is related to hematocrit. You guys remember what hematocrit is? Okay. Pearson, you remember what hematocrit is?
I don't.
So you don't. Okay. Callie, can you help Pearson? What is hematocrit?
It's red blood cells and
Yes.
red blood cells, but mostly red blood cells.
Okay, but it's red blood cells as a percentage of what? Do you remember?
Like the actual percentage, or what do you mean?
Like, if I wanted to calculate my hematocrit percentage, what would I need for my denominator? No? Blood volume, right? It's just the hematocrit is the amount of your blood that is red blood cells, basically, right? So if I want to carry more oxygen, I need more red blood cells, okay? Alex is a bigger person than Megan is. We're going to guess that Alex has a larger blood volume, therefore he has more red blood cells. He has a larger O2 carrying capacity than Megan does. Now, he's also bigger, so it may not help him in any way. It may just be that he needs that because he's bigger, right? You've got more tissue that needs oxygen. So, within each of us, when we begin to exercise, one of the kind of positive things that happens is we do something called hemoconcentration, okay? And so this is what's going to happen when Ryan goes to the gym and she rips out a bunch of curls, okay? And then she goes to the mirror and she's like, yeah, look at my biceps. I'm pretty shredded up today, right? And those things. What has happened is she has hemoconcentrated her blood, okay? because she has taken the plasma or the water that was in her blood and pushed some of it out into her contracting skeletal muscle, which makes her skeletal muscle swell up, right? And some of it's also going to get pushed into the veins, so she's going to look all veiny. Be like, look at them all swole today. I'm sure you've never done that, right, Ryan? But I bet if we went to the gym, we could find some dudes that are all about doing a little bit of that. Okay? I'm sure we've all done it. Yes,
Is
sir.
that like what people say they have a pump?
Yes, that is the pump.
That is the
Yeah.
pump.
It's so we're concentrating the blood by driving the plasma into the muscles. Yes, that's the pump. Okay? And so when you lose water out of the blood, your blood volume goes down, but your hematocrit percentage actually goes up because you've lost some water, but the red blood cells have stayed the same. So the volume of red blood cells is the same, but your total blood volume has gotten smaller. And so the percentage that those red blood cells make up of your blood volume is actually higher. Having a higher percentage of red blood cells is easier for diffusion, okay, both in the lungs and the tissues. It's going to make diffusion easier. So in doing that, we have said that we have increased our O2 carrying capacity. We've actually made our blood volume go down, which is not great, but it gets offset by this, so it's not that big of a deal. Okay? The better way to do this is not to hemoconcentrate. The better way to do this is to just take some erythropoietin, like your Lance, and you just get more red blood cells, right? Or you go down to, CSL Plasma and you donate some blood and you give them some plasma. I've never done that. I don't know if they take whole blood when they do that too. Just go give a couple pints of whole blood, put it in the freezer for about 3 months, and then we'll come back, and once you've returned back to normal, we'll give you the blood back. We'll give you your own blood back. Now you have more blood, more red cells. Or we could spin the blood and just get the red cells and just give you the red cells. We'd probably kill you if we did that. That's okay.
I did find out that CSL plasma is, if you have COVID, they give you $100 to donate.
Really?
As an antibodies. And you can donate twice a week. That's $200 a week.
We know what Megan's doing this weekend. No mask and I'm going out. Let's go. Mama needs a new pair of shoes. So anyway, so that's going to happen. That's actually a positive. We'll talk more about kind of changes in O2 carrying capacity when we get into aerobic training. Okay. There are some gender differences as it relates to VO2 max and maximal stroke volume and cardiac output and O2 carrying capacity between men and women, but they may be a little bit different between max exercise and sub-max exercise. So in general, I'm sorry, ladies, y'all have drawn the short end of the stick here, okay? You tend to have lower VO2 max, lower max cardiac output, lower stroke volume, okay? Your heart rate's pretty much the same, and a little bit of a lower O2 carrying capacity than the guys. A lot of that's just related to body size. If we normalize for body size, most of those things are going to go away, which are just smaller. So therefore, you're at a little bit of a disadvantage. During sub-maximal exercises, women tend to use more of their cardiac output at a given workload. They're going to have lower CaO2, which is I'm gonna fuck this up. It's little a. That is arterial O2 concentration, right? Little a is arterial. It's not alveolar. Yeah, I think so. We'll sort that out. We're not talking about pulmonary stuff, so that's arterial O2 concentration. A little bit lower stroke volume, and therefore they've got higher cardiac output at a lower stroke volume, so that's to be offset by a higher heart rate. Okay? So it's becoming more and more common now. Okay? Ladies, I apologize on behalf of all men. Okay? Guys, we're not going to say not all guys, we're not going to say not all men. Okay? But it's become much more of a thing in exercise physiology. Now, women are understudied. Okay? And for the most part now, if you want to get federal funding to do exercise things, or even if you just want to do things in the lab here, we basically have to include both genders. or I should say we have to include both sexes, sorry. And then we have to, if we only want to use one, we have to write some sort of justification for why it's not okay for us to test both men and women. You can test just women much easier than you can justify testing just men. We tend to not have that big of a problem because historically the menstrual cycle messes things up. Because ladies, your respiratory response, like your things change depending upon where we are in your cycle, and out of the ease of things, having to try to time testing so everybody is in the same sort of couple of day window in your menstrual cycle, which is tricky. It's more difficult, and they use that for forever to justify not testing them. Plus, we thought your uterus would fall out if you ran too far. So, the patriarchy, baby. Anyway, so we are beginning to learn more and more. There's some really fascinating differences between men and women in these things. And it's important for us to try to understand how much of that is sort of sex hormone driven or not, how much of it is driven by differences in body fat, because there's going to be different things during menopause as the hormones change and things. And so you're going to see more and more of this. You guys are going to do your thesis or your theses. And we're going to say, well, why are you testing men and women? Why are you not? God forbid you have Dr. Deb on your committee, you will test women, right? Which you should. You should. She's in no way, shape, or form wrong, but like we need to. The numbers somebody has is going to be the numbers that they're like just so crazy understudied. I mean, it's like 70-30 or something, not so on the amount of data that we have on men to women. So, anyhow. I'm not saying you could make an entire career out of studying differences between men and women in their responses to exercise, but you certainly will. This is all of the things that we've talked about. This is the one kind of graph, and I apologize that it's small. I had to scan it out of a textbook that was scanned out of something else. You don't really want to know. But it shows heart rate, stroke volume, cardiac output, blood pressure, O2 consumption, total peripheral resistance, and AVO2 difference, all in the same people at the same cycling power output and percentage of their VO2 max. And so if you want an overlay of how all of these things are changing in concert with each other, it's all on this one potential slide. Okay? Pretty safe bet. Hey, Dr. Black, does this go up during exercise? Yes. If it's a cardiovascular parameter, it probably goes up, unless it's total peripheral resistance. Right? Pretty much everything else is gonna get rid of that. Okay, so these were some really fascinating kinds of things. People talking about integrating the Fick equation in VO2. These are some really old data out of the Harvard Fatigue Lab, which I should probably spend some time talking about the Harvard Fatigue Lab. But each line, it's not Missile Commander for any of my Atari people. These represent an individual participant. And what you will see is this is time and this is oxygen uptake. And then basically everybody, no, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. This is the same person tested a bunch of different times, and they're cycling at different power outputs. My apologies. And I want you to know that the time it takes them to reach max is basically the same. Their max is the same, and the time it takes them to get there is not the same. And so at lower power outputs, you can still go to max, but it takes you a little bit longer. This is all pretty straight. Here, they did not go to max. We'll talk about that towards the end of the class. We'll talk about what we are under. There's a physiological parameter that's going to control why this very small change in kilopounds, that's not that small of a change, this change in KP, it's going to move this over a certain parameter, and that's why this one goes to max and not doesn't. Anyway, okay. In a regular semester, I would give you a paper, and we would have a debate in class about what are the things that limit VO2 max, and is it convective, or is it diffusive, or what do we know? Are we limited by cardiac output, or are we limited by the muscles and their mitochondrial ability to do things? And the answer is, well, it depends. Right? It depends on many, many things. It may be one thing in very highly trained people at sea level. It may be something very different in an untrained person if you go to altitude or if you go into space or something. So it's going to depend. But in general, okay, in general, we tend to think that, let me be very careful how I say this, but in a lot of instances, you may be limited by cardiac output. Or what you may be limited by is the ability to get the cardiac output, to get the oxygen from the blood, kind of get it into the muscles. You're not limited by the actual number of mitochondria very often, right? We can create artificial situations where we do small muscle mass exercise and things where we can super saturate. We can make sure we've got plenty of blood to go to that working muscle, and we can drive mitochondria harder than what they're going to see in some other place. We can isolate them. They really are going to get maxed out. So there's some things that are going on. This has been a big debate. You go to the ACSM meeting and people would yell at each other. Okay, so I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to skip over the pulmonary stuff. We're just I'll do a narrated lecture on that for you guys. And then you guys can wish to jump into the training responses. I'm more than a little bit panicked about that is a great question. I don't know. What, today's Thursday? Probably 2 Tuesdays from now. Would probably be the over the 17th. Okay. So the next thing that we're going to do is not pulmonary things. We're going to start talking about what I think are the most fun things outside of muscles in exercise physiology. Okay? This is the thing that most people are really interested in. And that's going to be adaptations to training. Okay? I'm going to train in a certain way. That's going to change something. Hopefully that's going to make me better at whatever it is that I'm doing, right? There's going to be these changes in your physiology that are going to then lead to changes or impart changes in your actual physical function, okay? So we're going to start off by doing aerobic training responses, okay? And so we're going to talk about how you should train. We're going to talk about what changes, and then we're going to talk about what is the stimulus, okay, that is going to be needed for those things. So if we understand really this third question, if we understand the needed stimulus to drive the change, and we know what change we need to get better, then those two things can really inform then how we need to go about doing our training regimens, okay? So in a lot of ways, we got to think about this backwards, right? You don't need to think about, I'm going to go run for 4 miles today at this pace and then kind of see what happens. What we need to think about is, okay, well, what do I want to happen? I want to get better at this. Okay, well then that's going to change by doing, X, Y, Z. Okay, so why do we train? Let's think about this. We can work our way through this systematically. From an aerobic perspective, why are we going to train? Okay, there may be a lot of people that are going to say, look, there's these very, very powerful health benefits for training, right? I don't want to discount those at all. For a lot of people, that is reason enough. If I do this, my blood pressure is better, my glucose tolerance is better, it's just good for me. All true. But you guys, I know why you guys want to train, right? There's a group of people that want to train because they want to improve their exercise performance, right? And so we're thinking of aerobic training. So now we're talking about running or biking or elliptical or something like that, right? And the primary thing that we need to change is going to be our VO2 max, right? In conjunction with that, if we can change our lactate threshold and a couple of other things, all of those things collectively are going to help us increase our exercise performance. So if you take an average person, the thing that's going to change the most, going to have the most profound impact on their performance, is we need to increase their VO2 max. Okay. So, that all being the case, what limits performance? What's going to limit my VO2 max? So in many instances, that is going to be fatigue. Okay? Fatigue is the enemy of, well, everything in a lot of ways. So with fatigue, okay, we're going to not be able to generate enough force. We're going to therefore not be able to max out our VO2 max or run any faster or do anything like that. So now we have to think about, well, what causes fatigue? Okay? The muscle itself can cause fatigue. There can be fatigue from our metabolic system response. There can be fatigue due to failures in the cardiovascular system or fatigue from failures in the respiratory system. Now, the respiratory is probably, the pulmonary system is probably in kind of healthy college age folks, the least involved out of all of this. Okay? And some people will argue that we should put metabolism in the muscle because it takes place in the muscle. We should stick that in there. Really is going to be kind of this, is it something about the muscle that's limiting us, or is it something about kind of our cardiorespiratory system that's limiting us? So what I want to get through today, and then we can really kind of dig into actual adaptations and changes on Tuesday of next week. What I want to talk about today is fatigue. Okay? I'm going to give you guys a very broad strokes look at fatigue. I think fatigue is really important. I think fatigue is very cool. A couple of summers ago, I taught an entire doctoral summer class on just fatigue. Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a taste, but not the whole meal on fatigue. Okay, just a taste. So this definition is really important. Hint, hint. Okay, fatigue is defined as a failure to maintain the required or expected force. Okay. Hold out the whatever these are, alcohol wipes out here. I don't know how to pronounce that. Janhi, I don't know. Anyway, I hold these out. Okay? At some point, I will no longer be able to hold these out here, and I will have to put my arm down. Okay? I will no longer be able to exert the required force to hold my arm out and hold this thing up. When that happens, fatigue. Does that make sense? Okay. Fatigue is not to be confused with weakness, okay? And weakness is not a quality judgment on things. Weakness is simply, from a physiological perspective, means that you cannot generate a sufficient initial force to do whatever task you're wanting to do, okay? My muscles are too weak. They have too much weakness to pick up my car. Make sense? Right? That's not fatigue. I'm not fatigued, I just can't generate that much force. Yes, I'm weak. Thank you, Jacob. I felt like when you said that there was a little bit of judgment in there, I kind of felt it. I feel that's not where we want to go, okay? So, how is fatigue different from muscle injury? Because sometimes they look the same from an outcome standpoint. Anybody sore right now? Anybody sore with anything? Megan, you're sore? Where? What? You mind me asking? Your legs?
Yeah, it's my heavy week, so I found the squat.
Okay. If we had you, because you're sore, if we had you try to squat again today, I predict that your winter will actually be down compared to where it was before. That's not fatigue, okay? That's muscle damage, that's injury, okay? but it looks like fatigue because she cannot generate as much force. In some ways, it also looks like weakness, right? You can't generate the same kind of thing. We won't even talk about that once you can generate a sufficient amount of force, that the damage actually makes you more fatiguable. So, things to keep in mind that recovery from fatigue is often very quick, but that recovery from muscle injury or muscle damage may take days to weeks, whereas very often fatigue can be recovered from in a couple of minutes. Okay? And you'll learn based upon kind of what that is, why are the rest periods that are recommended in between sets of resistance training, why are the use what they are. Okay? And so they're not just made up out of nowhere. When we talk of fatigue, generally we put fatigue into two main kind of categories. One is peripheral and one is central. Okay? Peripheral fatigue is going to talk about fatigue that is the result of a failure of physiological function, okay, somewhere from the motor neuron, okay, to the muscle that limits force production. Okay? Sites may range from action potential propagation down the axon, from there, anywhere out to someplace in the cross-bridge cycle. Now, to be 100% honest, people argue over whether we include the ability of the motor neuron to fire as peripheral fatigue or if that is central fatigue. I tend to think that, so it's basically anything distal of the motor neuron. So from the motor axon all the way to the cross-bridge, that's peripheral fatigue. Central fatigue is brain to firing of the motor neuron. Okay? Central fatigue is motivation. That's an easy way to think about it, okay? Think about the last time you did some exercise and think if you stopped for some reason because you thought you were fatigued. Think if you could have gone one more step. Could you have done one more rep or moved something again if you just really wanted to, if you just really tried hard? My guess is yes, okay? That's central fatigue. This hurts, I don't like it, stop, okay? That's central fatigue. So central fatigue often involves things from the motor cortex on down what we call these descending motor pathways. It is also very often going to play a large role in fatigue during long duration exercise. Peripheral fatigue is going to be much more common during kind of shorter high intensity bouts of things. Okay? Very, very kind of strong metabolic byproduct buildup, hydrogen ions messing everything up, that's causing peripheral fatigue. Central fatigue, okay, is motivational. It's longer, it's slower to develop. It may be related to levels of plasma glucose. Your brain doesn't like it. It may be related to thermoregulation and temperature, or it may be just simply related to I don't feel like doing this because I'm not motivated. There are people that argue, and they make some interesting points, that basically all fatigue in our daily lives is central. I don't think that's right. Okay. Man, when you did your 100 max up the other day, you went to failure, right? You get to failure, that's not central fatigue. At failure, it's probably plenty of central and peripheral fatigue that's happening. Now, if you're just saying I'm walking around today and I'm just kind of not doing a whole lot and whatever, then maybe. Okay, but there are some people that argue that peripheral fatigue doesn't ever really exist because you never go all the way until your muscles are stuck in what is we would call a tetanus cramp. Right? You never go all the way to that point. You can't motivate yourself to drive things to that point. I'm not so sure. Okay? So it's hard for us to measure peripheral fatigue in humans. Okay? So one of the things that we can do is we have to use electrical stimulation very often to try to measure peripheral fatigue. Because if I want to know something is wrong with your motor axon, how do I test that without you voluntarily, your brain telling your muscle to contract, so I can measure what's happening in the axon? But what's happening in the axon is dependent upon what's also happening in your brain. And so those two things are inextricably linked. So one of the ways that we tend to study peripheral fatigue is we take the brain out of it. Okay? I can apply stimulation to the motor axon. I can apply stimulation if I want to in some ways to the brain. Now, Dr. Pereira can do this, okay? Or I can apply it over the muscle directly. And each of those will tell me a slightly different thing. But what I look for though is, say I stimulate your motor axon, and I watch the twitch amplitude from a single action potential from some muscle of choice downstream. If that decreases, okay, then we can make an argument that there's an impairment somewhere from where we applied the stem down to the cross bridge. Something has sort of gone down. Okay? Decreases in maximal force, decreases in the rate of tension development, decreases in power. So we can use E-stim, we can look at all of these different kinds of things that we want to tell us that there may be an impairment somewhere in the myosin ATPase, in the calcium ATPase function, in the release of acetylcholine across the neuromuscular junction, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So they can all tell us some things. Here's some interesting data. And so what we've done with this, and you guys tell me what you think this is. So here, okay, this is a raw EMG signal. So this is a measure of the action potentials in the muscle fibers and the peripheral axons over a muscle. And we're having a person hold a load that is about 25% of their max. Okay? So kick to 25% of your maximal knee extension and hold that. And I want you to hold it all the way out until you can't hold it anymore. Hold it all the way out into fatigue. And so what you see from this EMG signal, and this is what we've done here is we've graphed them. We've just taken like every basically 10% of their total time. We've graphed everything out. What we're looking at is here force production on the bottom. Force production is constant, so they're holding, then they dip. And then this is the change in EMG. So what we are seeing is that as I begin to fatigue over time, I'm actually changing the amount of signal that my central nervous system is sending out to the muscle. I'm recruiting more and more muscle. I'm turning on more and more motor axons and more muscle fibers to get the same force. That's another way to quantify fatigue. Is this peripheral? Is this central? I would think that for the first part up here, what is happening is we're experiencing peripheral fatigue, and the central nervous system is sending more signals in an effort to overcome that and compensate for it. But at some point out here, the peripheral kills me. Okay? It just kind of subsumes and overdoes the entire system. This is another way that we do things. Keldon, I think, has either had this done to him or seen it done a bunch. I'm not sure that any of the rest of you guys have. It's a technique called twitch interpolation. And so you can do it either by stimulating the brain, you can stimulate kind of right here, okay, in the basal ganglia, kind of right under, kind of in the brainstem, or you can stimulate directly over a motor axon, or you can stimulate the muscle. But the idea is all the same. It's, I have you generate force, kick or squeeze or whatever you're doing as forcefully as you can. While you are doing that, I zap that muscle or that motor neuron with a supramaximal amount of stimulation. That should, in theory, then turn every bit of muscle that you have down there on and make it all fire. And then by doing that, we can see what were you able to do by yourself, and then how much extra can we get on top of it by applying this maximal stimulation. The more extra force that we get, then the more central fatigue you have. The more your brain is not able to tell that muscle to turn on at it. Okay? And so that's one of the ways that we can quantify those things. So let's talk about some sites of peripheral fatigue. Action potential propagation, you can have an axon branch block. So this is in the motor axon. Okay. So this is trying to block things out there. This is, I mean, it's not that uncommon, but it's kind of difficult for us to measure. There could be a decrease in the amount of acetylcholine released into the neuromuscular junction, which often is the result of a depletion of acetylcholine on the nervous system side. This is really, really, really difficult for us to get under voluntary contraction circumstances. So I can put the electrodes on you and stimulate you enough that I can probably deplete acetylcholine. Okay? You really can't do that by yourself. It's an evolution. It would be evolutionarily disadvantageous for you to be able to do it all the way to that point, because then you would basically be paralyzed for, right, until you could replenish some. So we can see it in animal models. We can see it in isolated muscle preps. We can see it in these very, very few kinds of stimulation conditions. So we also see weird things that are going to be different from stimulating a muscle directly versus stimulating the motor axon. And so this is going to be one of the ways that we can try to quantify if we're getting neurotransmitter depletion. Here is stimulation of a muscle at 20 hertz. So the top in the black is we put the electrodes on the muscle. So if anybody has ever had TINs or something like that during rehab, you get it on and it makes your muscle kind of jump around and twitch. Okay. This is 20 action potentials a second. It's TINs, but it's TINs that's not messing around. It's enough to make you like actually, if it was on your quad, like you actually want to kick your knee out. Okay. The converse of this here that you see in the open circles is stimulating the motor axon. So keeping with our quad, this would be putting an electrode up here over the femoral nerve, not the world's most pleasant thing in the world. Although in a lot of instances, to be honest, finding it is more awkward than actually doing the stimulation. What I want you to note is if I give you 20 hertz stimulation, I do the exact same thing. Okay, I get more fatigue if I do the stimulation on the axon side because I'm on the proximal side of the junction. And we think what is happening when we do the nerve stimulation is that we are beginning to get some depletion. We're getting all of the peripheral kind of on the distal side of the junction fatigue that we would get here, plus some additional that is due to the depletion of the junction. Okay, and it gets more pronounced. The differences get bigger as we increase the firing rate, so we'll just send more and more action potentials in there. Okay, so kind of an interesting thing. Probably the most common side of peripheral fatigue is a failure of excitation contraction coupling. It's a failure either in the sarcolemma or the T-tubule or in the ryanodine units release of calcium. Okay? Those are going to be sort of failure to signal in the T-tubules. You're going to accumulate potassium ions in the interstitial space, and that leads to a decrease in the excitability of the membrane, of the cell membrane there in the T-tubule, so it's harder to transmit signal. Okay, or we're going to get some kind of an impairment or a failure of calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Okay, increasing intracellular ADP and magnesium are going to both inhibit the ryanodine receptor. So ryanodine is going to be where we're going to release the calcium. If you accumulate a lot of inorganic phosphate from the breakdown of ATP as well, the inorganic phosphate may enter back up into the sarcoplasmic reticulum and bind with calcium in the form of precipitate. It's not great. So that's reducing availability of calcium. We're not releasing it, or we're not able to get it back out even if it's open. Or there may be a failure to pump a sufficient amount of calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum in that way. So this is really probably the most common kind of cause of peripheral fatigue that we're going to come across. Okay. And if anybody cares about these things, there's some pretty straightforward ways to measure these kinds of things. In my lab, or Dr. Mike's lab, or Dr. Carter's lab, we are set up to be able to measure a lot of things. So you could do an exercise protocol, and with depending upon what we experience to do, we could try to isolate down, like, is this failure of a T-tube? Is this failure of neurotransmitter release? Is this actually central at the motor axon or at the motor neuron, or is it in your brain? So we can apply some different techniques and try to tease out those individual things and see where it may happen. Okay. Don't worry about muscle wisdom. That's not really, I don't know why I leave all of that in. Don't worry about the fatigue reflex. It's a pretty cool thing, but we're not gonna talk about that. Okay. All right. So central fatigue, on the other hand, is fatigue associated with alterations in central nervous system function that cannot be reasonably explained by dysfunction within the muscle. So it's basically everything that is proximal to the muscle, or everything that's really motor neuron and proximal to that, we're going to call central fatigue. Okay. we can do these kind of tests of central drive or something like that to see kind of how much signal is the brain sending that's getting through the motor neurons to get out to your muscles. Okay? So, possible mechanisms. What are the things that are going to cause central fatigue? Well, there may be reduced signaling to the muscles from the brain or the motor neurons. So your motor cortex is not sending as much of a signal. Or your motor neuron is not letting as much of that signal go through. It's kind of gating those kinds of things. This sort of stuff may be the result of afferent feedback from the muscles. Pain, exertion, depletion of certain substrates, buildup of hydrogen ions. So there will be, if you want to know more, you can sit in briefly on my ACSM thing tomorrow. I'm talking about afferent feedback and pain and what do we know about regulating endurance exercise performance on it. That stuff is going to be there, okay? So you get these signals from the periphery, they feed back to the brain of the motor neurons and say, hey, we don't like what's going on, we better dial this back, okay? Substrate depletion, glucose goes too low, muscle glycogen falls too much. Those things can also lead to central fatigue, and then an increase in core body temperature. Your body temperature gets above 40 degrees Celsius, and the brain is going to start to shut things down. Substrate depletion, we can kind of talk about. All right, we'll stop there. Okay. Whirlwindiness. Okay. Tuesday, next week, we will have a quiz. We will have a quiz on stuff from aerobic exercise. Okay?
Which, is it the aerobic training and everything?
Yes. That is correct.
What do you want the critical thinking to do for that?
Are there separate critical thinking questions for